Alright, so in today's lesson we're going to have a look at the modern liberal philosopher John Rawls. He developed on the transitional liberalism espoused by John Stuart Mill, and as you can see there, he lived between 1921 to 2002, so he was one of the major modern liberal forces of the 20th century. We're going to go over his essentially antithesis in political thought with Michael Oakeshott next lesson. But although a lot of the stuff he says is, I would probably say, incorrect and based on false political idealism, which you can date back to Rousseau and even earlier to Plato, he's still important to understand if you're going to be writing an essay on liberalism. So let's get into John Rawls. The time in which he lived. John Rawls lived through several key movements that clearly had a profound impact on his works and his views on politics. Rawls lived through the French existentialist movement and the New Atheist movement in the 1990s. For those of you who do not know, the French existentialists can essentially be summed up as Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre. There are others, but they are the main three French existentialists. We'll do another video on that because it's quite an important movement. And you likely already know about the New Atheists being Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. So, the postmodernist movement was also very popular during the period, and it clearly had a profound impact on his political opinions. It is important to take these movements into account when reviewing his works, as they clearly had a profound impact on his opinions. His works rested on the theory of altruism espoused by these movements, and his popularity can be denoted to the altruistic egalitarianism that arose from other key thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Christopher Hitchens. Now, I'm not a fan of Sartre whatsoever, but I am a fan of Christopher Hitchens. He says some very damning things about Mother Teresa as well in a documentary he made. He's a very important figure. He started off as socialist and became more conservative as he grew older. Well, I don't really say that. He became more classically liberal as he grew older, and you can see that in his opinions if you really study Hitchens. But anyway, his sentiments were able to essentially rewrite the term liberal to mean something completely different to what it had formerly meant, as the left accepted these ideas both due to their popularity and the counterculture narrative that surrounded them, as the right was still dominated by traditional Christian values until the 20th century. I should really say the 21st century, but essentially the counterculture at the time would have been left-wing. I know in the modern day most of the counterculture tends to be right-wing, as right-wing people do not have the institutions to back them up. But essentially in the 20th century, for much of it, you still had a lot of Christian theism dominating the public discourse. So whatever is the side that is out, whichever side essentially the underdog really, tends to be more popular among the next generation. So, Rawls and modern liberalism. I've got a picture of John Maynard Keynes there, because Keynesian economics is integral to modern liberalism. John Rawls was the father of modern liberalism, and he highlighted the principles of this ideology in his book Theory of Justice. His modern liberalism advocated for foundational equality as opposed to mere formal equality under the law. So that's essentially giving people money to start off with in life so they all kind of have the same. Now, that's really questioning, he's saying a theory of justice, that's more talking about social justice. And essentially, is it really moral to effectively steal money from some people to give it to others. Although it is very controversial, I'd probably say, while I disagree with it, there is some validity to what he says. So if you think back to the preamble of the US Constitution, how did it start? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defence, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So essentially, if you want to have a link between classical and modern liberalism, that would be one there, because essentially ensuring foundational equality in this sense ensures that that everyone is on an equal playing field when they are starting out, and you could say it might harken back to the notion of providing for the common welfare or whatever. So, as a means to achieve this foundational equality, Rawls advocated for progressive taxation and extensive public spending as a means to redistribute wealth through a society to balance out the socio-economic landscape. Now that I do not agree with whatsoever. You can start to see the more socialistic elements emerging from modern liberalism, and when we go more into socialism, you'll probably find that it's hard to distinguish it from third-way socialism. But I digress. And if you don't know, progressive taxation is essentially taxing people who earn more a greater percentage of their wages. So, yeah. This essentially can be concluded as advocating for both equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And as you likely know, that is a very socialist doctrine. Has very little to do with the original classical and transitional liberals, who essentially only advocate for equality of opportunity. A great example that you could put in an essay would be Thomas Paine, as he fervently argues for equality of opportunity in his book The Rights of Man, and I believe it was volume 2 where he really gets into it. So, Rawls and the positions, this is probably the most important part. Rawls constructed several philosophical conditions to justify his beliefs. For instance, his original position was one where individuals were asked to construct a society better than the one they currently lived in. The second condition was the veil of ignorance, where individuals would imagine they were a yet-to-be-born individual, and they would not know the conditions that they would be born into. He used this idea to justify an egalitarian society where people would start at the same point to maximize fairness. So essentially thinking about, imagine you were just a consciousness floating above the earth, and it would just be like a random roll of the dice to see where you'd be brought up, which country, how wealthy your parents would be. Essentially, Rawls wants to make it equal for everyone. Not very fair in my opinion, but so this also feeds into the notion of progressive taxation, as I previously elaborated on. Although Rawls was proposing redistributive justice via progressive taxation, he claimed that this was distinct from socialism, as he still allowed for inequality of outcome and a capacity for self-improvement, although he did do his best to try and mitigate this inequality of outcome. He contradicts himself, though, in the sense that he claims that progressive taxation is consistent with the notion of government by consent, when in reality, since the most successful earners will always be in the minority in a capitalist economy, they will have no say in such affairs. So essentially that's a topic we'll go into when we do Nietzsche, of the tyranny of the majority. So, this is because all of those whom earn above the median wage will be in the minority by definition, so they will always lose a vote against those voting to increase their taxes. Ayn Rand expands on this idea in Atlas Shrugged, where she advocated for the men of industry to strike in such an event to exercise their power over the mob that would result from a democratic republic with the power to tax the top percentages to benefit the majority. And this is an idea that we can see in modern days with the Canadian trucker protest, and in ancient history with the secession of the plebs in ancient Rome, where essentially the skilled workers would leave the city unless their employers started paying them more. It's quite different to trade union activity because it's more focused on skilled labour as opposed to unskilled labour. Although, to be fair, I would argue that mining is fairly skilled labour. So, to summarise, John Rawls' famous works were Toward a Just World Order, The Path to a Theory of Social Justice, Reticent Socialist, and A Theory of Justice. So, from that you can probably guess he was very similar to the World Economic Forum nowadays. I imagine George Soros would have liked him. And Rawls's core ideas were altruism, the veil of ignorance, redistributive justice, modern liberalism, social justice, and foundational equality. And I recommend you take note of that and use all of those terms when discussing Rawls in your essay. So that sums it up for Rawls. Thank you. We'll go into Michael Oakeshott next.